Okay, we'll just give just 30 seconds just to allow other people to join, and then we'll get cracking. Okay, we'll get cracking now. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name's Helen Cargill. I'm the Director for Education for TIA. And if you've got any questions after this, please feel free to contact me and I'll follow them up with you. I'm joined today by Walter Akers. Walter is a specialist in procurement, public procurement, and he's going to take you through the Reform Act. He's got over 30 years experience. So over to you, Walter.
Hi, thank you, Helen. And hello, good afternoon to everybody. It's fantastic to see. If I have a look there, we've got 30 people joining us today, which is fantastic. And good afternoon. As Helen said, my name is Walter Akers, and I am I'm a specialist in public procurement. I've spent a lot of time over the last few years focusing on this subject of procurement reform and how it's impacting the public sector and suppliers. And that's what we're going to spend a half an hour talking about today. We've been running a series of these, and each time we have a slightly different focus depending on the sector and the audience. And today's focus is education. So those are, largely it's multi-academy trusts, universities, FE colleges, those sorts of organizations. That said, what we, say, and the Procurement Act in particular, applies to everybody across the whole of the public sector. So if you're not from education, you'll learn a lot here today in the next half an hour anyway. So welcome. So procurement reform, what's it all about? So really what happened is that following Brexit, one of the key areas that Brexit looked at and was one of the key points that was debated was around the fact that the legislation that we inherit whilst we were part of the European Union, which we inherited and needed to copy and enact into our local legislation, was seen as overly bureaucratic and rules driven. And there was quite a lot of criticism about the fact that, particularly with procurement, that it was stifling the way that public money was being spent and that we could do better. Now, if you agree with that or not, that's a different political debate, but that's really what was driving this procurement reform, in the UK. So it's the first significant change to our legislation following Brexit, and Brexit was really the trigger that started this. And it all kicked off in late 2020, when the Cabinet Office issued a white paper on transforming public procurement, and they set out their ambition, and it took a number of years for us to end up where we are today, which is really having this this piece of legislation. So there are two pieces of legislation really which comprise procurement reform. It's the Procurement Act, which you probably have heard quite a lot about, and it's the one that's received most of the publicity. The Procurement Act came into force earlier this year on the 24th of February 2025. And then the second piece of legislation, which I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on today, is the provider selection regime, which came into force on the 1st of January 2024. The provider selection regime really is focused on healthcare services that are commissioned and bought by the NHS and local authorities. And given our focus today on education, education's really got very little to do with the provider selection regime. So I'm not going to say very much more about it through here, but just be aware that it is actually another piece of legislation which forms part of this reform. And it's replacing, so if we look at specifically looking at the Procurement Act, it has replaced the old legislation. So the old legislation we had, the primary one that procurement people were working through, is Public Contract Regulations 2015. It was a piece of legislation that came to us as an EU directive. And in the UK, we just copied it and into local law. That's how it became the Public Contract Regulation 2015, became UK law. And it's been operating even after Brexit, it was the law of the land because it's enacted into our legislation, and that public contract regulations is reflecting the directives from the EU, and it is consistent across the whole of the European Union. Um, and there are other pieces of legislation which were exactly the same: the concessions, the utilities, and the defence regulations. All of those have now been replaced by the Procurement Act. Now, because of our devolved arrangement in the United Kingdom, it is not the same across the 4 different nations. Um, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland have adopted the Procurement Act with some small tweaks and changes there, but it's quite minor, really. England, Northern Ireland, and Wales, so that's where the Procurement Act applies. It does not apply in Scotland to matters which are devolved to Scotland. Obviously, matters which are reserved to Westminster, like defence, actually will be covered by the Procurement Act because those are reserved for Westminster. So it's quite complicated. I'm not sure if we have anybody on today who is from Scotland, but the Scots have stuck with the old rules for their devolved arrangements, and there's going to be divergence, which my view is unhelpful at one level because it makes the market very confusing for suppliers. There is another level which has added a little bit of complexity, is that the Procurement Act is not retrospective. So it applies progressively, going forward from 24th of February this year, which means that for a number of years, we're going to have both regimes in operation at the same time, because old existing contracts, so contracts that were signed before the 24th of February, procurements that were commenced before the 24th of February this year, will continue to be operated under the old rules. It is only procurements that have been started after the 24th of February that will, the Procurement Act will apply to. So there's levels of complexity that go on here. The other thing which will be of interest to the audience today is that the one part of the public sector which has been given some exemptions from the requirement are schools as defined in the legislation. And schools include certain FE colleges. There's a definition in section 123 of the Act of what a school is. It's what we would ordinarily know as a school, the multi-academy trust, but it also includes FE colleges as well. So if you were a FE college, I would go find out if that exemption applies, because it means that certain requirements, the below threshold requirements and some of the notifications, you don't need to comply with, which is very helpful, actually. In respect to that, there's no other part of the public sector which has been given any sort of dispensation in this way. So that would be of interest to education. Okay, now the big picture here, and that's really what we're going to be covering in the next sort of 20 minutes, is that this is not a tweak of the existing legislation, the old legislation. This is a complete rewrite. They took the opportunity to really try and change things as radically as they possibly could, and it's reflected in the legislation. I'm quite a fan of it, I must be honest. I know change can be hard for people to embrace at times, but I like the direction that it's gone in. I like the wording. In fact, I think it's quite accessible. It's easy to read. It's in English. It makes sense. It is far less bureaucratic, actually, and rules driven, and we'll cover that in a moment. As the slide says, no, it's far less directive. But obviously it's change, and change is hard for us to embrace. And the sort of big picture around all of this. So the first one is it's far less directive. The old legislation set out a lot of requirements which really said you have to do the following things. There were steps of procedures. And there was a comfort in that because, if you're given a set of rules and they are quite clearly need to be followed and there's very little judgment or discretion involved, well, there's a comfort in that. But there's also, it hems you in. And what it doesn't allow is for flexibility. And because they've taken a lot of the direction out of this, the rules, they've made it much more judgment and principle and objective driven. I mean, you know, it's still a piece of legislation. There are still rules, but there are far fewer directive ones and long lists of things you need to do, sort of checklists. That has created a lot more flexibility. And that was one of the real big policy intents behind all of this. Their ambition was to allow the public sector to buy in a way which is far more flexible, far more creative, and hopefully much more commercial, and will drive greater value for money overall, and have far better impact for our public purse. And those two things really go together. And when you look at the legislation, absolutely, this is a completely different change, okay, in the way that this has been done. The price that they put on that, though, is that in order to get all this flexibility and far less rules, they have required a lot more transparency. So a lot more of what we do when buying in the public sector, a lot more of your activities are going to have to be put into public notices and are going to have to be published on the central digital platform, the Find a Tender service. And they're going to be available to the public at large. Okay. And this transparency has some very big implications. It's going to place a burden on public sector organizations, procurement people, but not just procurement people, contract managers and others, to actually fill out all these notices. There are lots of them. They cover not just the pre-award phase, but also after a contract has been signed. There's lots of post-award contract management notices for the first time. And actually, the way that the notices have been created and are tied together means that you can cross-reference things. You can cross-reference the contract management to the original, to procurement, through to the payments, through to the exit, through to the how the whole process was run. Everything can be linked through. And that's a very big change for us in all of this. So that has quite some quite big implications if we look at this. The next one round is that in two particular areas, there has been a significant move away from market competition being the default. And this is quite a big change in ideology. At the moment, under the old rules, it was viewed that market competition was the cornerstone to achieving value for money and proprietary. Okay, if you have a competitive tender, that's how you achieve your value for money. That's how you show that you've done this in an open and fair and honest way. And there has been a very significant departure from this in the provider selection regime. Now, I know I said I wasn't going to talk too much about it, but I think it's an important thing to understand, because ideologically, this is a very big change, and it's a change in tone around the whole system. Is that the provider selection regime now has as its default position the ability to directly award contracts without competition. And the way that you prove value for money is through your internal governance. That's quite a big change in the approach. Now, as I said, that doesn't apply to education. It doesn't apply to schools or FE colleges or universities. It does only apply to local authorities and to the NHS. But it still is a very big change to the whole environment. The other area is that within the light touch regime, light touch contracts within the Procurement Act, there are lots of dispensations, and one of them is the ability to modify, to change contracts during their life in a way that in effect means that you can change and modify and extend those contracts in perpetuity without notice, without putting a notice into the public domain. And my feeling is that is a very big departure from market competition. It's a small area of public spend, these light touch contracts, but it only applies to services, particular services. It would be of interest to schools to know that school catering contracts actually can be light touch contracts. And I would recommend any school that is buying catering services that should be your starting point, because of the dispensations that are given to you in the legislation under light touch. It's much, much better to procure those contracts as a light touch contract. Talk to your procurement people, talk to your procurement advisors and your legal people. It should be your starting position. You might decide not to do it as a light touch, but you should really consider it, because the dispensations are huge for schools, because it's one of those areas. It's schools catering contracts are on the list of allowed light touch contracts. So the other area is all of this requires an enhanced role for governance. If you have a system that operates based on judgment, within the parameters of objectives and principles, if you have far greater flexibility and discretion in exercising that flexibility, all of that needs to be exercised and operated within a appropriate governance framework. And that's for you and your organization to set up the governance. That governance is not the governance that's set out in the legislation by and large. A lot of this governance is required within your organization and needs to be updated. It needs to be current. The old governance will not be good enough for this new regime. It's one of the challenges I have for you today is your governance updated? You need to be starting really with your contract standing orders or your procedure rules, which should be on your website. Have they been updated? And then has your governance that flows from that been updated? The way that you manage these contracts, and all of that. Now, sitting next to that governance, because governance in its own right really is can't operate. You need processes and controls and assurance to make that governance real. Okay, and those also need to be updated. So, really quite an enhanced role for governance. They've turbocharged the transparency, all these notices that we're going to be making going forward through digitalization. It's really being linked together through unique identifiers on the central digital platform, that the public, contracting authorities, anybody can go onto the find a tender service and can go and look at notices and then can link them together because it's all digitized. What this is going to mean is we're going to have a wealth of intelligent information going forward, which is going to be able, allow us really to do some fantastic data analysis because of this digitization. But it's also going to mean that the transparency is going to be enhanced because of it, because it's easier now for anybody to link things together. Our public procurement is far less in the shadows. It's much, much, much more accessible. And I think that's a very big point that they've brought in here. The Procurement Act actually is not just dealing with procurement. Very big change is there are now lots of requirements that involve the period after a contract is signed, so post-award contract management. No longer are our commercial disputes or our poor performing contracts going to be kept private. Those matters, up to this point, have largely been a private matter between the contracting authority and their suppliers. That has changed. There are now lots of notices and requirements in the legislation. This is a very big change because, our contract managers have never really been subject to this legislation before. They are now subject to it. There are things they have to do in terms of the law and these notices that need to be put out. This is a very big and significant change in this particular area. So, for instance, one of the notices that needs to be published is if there is poor performance. Let's say, on one of your contracts, there's a KPI that's being missed, or there's evidence of breach or poor performance. You need to make a notice. You need to put a public notice out there to say our supplier is not performing. The law requires you to make that a public notice. That public notice is actually then becomes grounds as evidence for exclusion and debarment from all public sector business, so not just business with you, but business across the whole of the public sector. There are certain steps and stages that need to be followed to get to that point, but that's the beginning of it. And that goes into the next point around is that there's been a significant enhancement to the powers given to contracting authorities to deal with bad behavior from suppliers, suppliers who have committed offences, but even further than that, just bad behavior, suppliers that behave in a way that is improper. There are very, very strong powers now given, and in fact, they can exclude a supplier from all public sector business for up to 5 years. Very powerful, and it's this debarment and exclusion regime which is significantly enhanced. We had a little bit of it before under the old regs, but nothing like we have today. So if you look across those 8 areas, you can see that this is not a tweak. This is not just a minor change to the existing legislation. This is significant change, and it's going to be disruptive. Now, the disruption, I feel, is worth it. I feel it's absolutely worth it, and we're going to end up in a better place. But it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for some time, and I sort of want to highlight some of these disruptive factors. What's going to? The first one is that our procurement experts and our contract managers, our people, our commercial people, and people making decisions around contracts and suppliers need a completely different skill set. If you're operating a system that's based on judgment, that's very different from a system that's based on a set of defined rules. There's a lot more thinking. There's a lot more of judgment, as I said, and then you're going to need to come to those judgments. You're going to need to be able to document them, and you're going to need to demonstrate that, how that has all worked. That is quite a different skill set to the one that we've had today. And procurement is an area which is underinvested in particular in education. I work a lot with multi-academy trusts and colleges in particular, and FE colleges, and a lot of them, might have one procurement person if they're lucky, a procurement expert. A lot of them, particularly the multi-academy trusts, have nobody with expertise in this particular area. It's an accountant or a finance person which is trying to, make this work as an additional responsibility. And this law, these regulations in this law is quite extensive. It's not something that you can pick up intuitively. And you need the skills and knowledge. And that's, I feel, is a really, we need greater investment here. It's really important, particularly for the smaller units. I urge multi-academy trusts in particular to look at, do you have the skills and knowledge to get this right, actually? You need enhanced governance. The governance needs to change because of the system and the fact that you're not following, detailed rules anymore. Quite an important point around enhanced governance. Just on that point, go and have a look if your contract standing orders, your procedure rules have been updated. Because if they haven't been updated, your governance is out of date and your people are not protected because they are actually, even if they're complying with the new law, your governance, they're not complying with your internal governance. You are required by law to actually have updated contract standing orders on your website because it's part of your transparency requirements. So go and have a look at those. Make sure they're right. It's a starting point within that. Yes, disruption in the additional notices. You need to be thinking not just about the skill that's needed in this and the new, to learn it, but we're going to require new systems and processes to be able to get the information that's necessary to fill out these notices, particularly the ones that are new and the ones that are post-award. Those notices that come, for contract management, we've never collected that information that's required now for these notices. And that needs to be looked at. You need, a lot of that's going to need IT systems to be changed. Whole organization impact. It's not just procurement and your legal advisors. It's now also your contract managers that need to get involved. And because of the enhanced governance, it has a far deeper reach into your governance organization, your governance structures. Whole organization impact, quite big. I've mentioned new processes and information systems. There are certain notices which are really hard. I mean, the publication, so there's a requirement to publish all payments on public contracts over £30,000. Central government's been doing this for a while, but people in education haven't. This is a significant requirement, and it's the information that needs to go with it is not actually in your accounts payable ledger. It's in other systems. This is going to require, some read across from different systems. It's just one example. There are lots of them, actually. So you need to look at your systems and processes. This goes without saying that there is an increased administrative burden. Initially people interpreted the ambition around the new Procurement Act of being greater flexibility, and more discretion and less rules to be less administration. I don't believe that's true. Because of the notices that need to be published, and also because you need to document judgment, which is quite hard. That's much more administration and much more documentation that's required in this process. Obviously, you need you're going to need different controls and assurance, and it's going to have to be better, I believe, because you're looking at judgments in particular. Also, some of the notices that you publish have such a profound impact on suppliers. Imagine you can publish a notice about poor performance that can mean that that organization can be excluded from public sector work for 5 years. A lot of your suppliers would go insolvent in those circumstances. You really need to make sure that you get that notice right, that the information is accurate and that it is fair. And that requires control and assurance over it to a degree which we've never had before. And then it's a completely new practice. It's a completely new language. At the end of the day, the law is about words. And one of the things about words is we might have a common understanding of what a word might mean. But actually, in the realm of law, in the realm of the Procurement Act, the interpretation of those words falls to the courts. And because they have changed every single word they possibly can, even if we think it means the same thing as what it meant under the old law, because they've used new words, we're not quite sure. And we'll only have certainty around this once the courts opine on this, which will take years. So our body of precedents, which have been set by the courts interpreting procurement legislation, really now needs to start again. And that means that this disruption, this unease about what this legislation actually means and what we do with it, we will only have greater clarity in the years to come. This is not something that's going to take just a few months. This will take years for the courts to look at all these things and end up giving us more, understanding as to what these words actually mean. So this disruption around the new words is going to go on for a very long time. So I've done a quick canter through the new legislation. I hope it's been useful to you. We have an offer for you. If you'd like a further conversation for us to talk about your circumstances in general terms, we're happy to do that for free. Obviously, if we need if you're looking for specific advice based on something, we'd have to sign up to terms on that. But we're very happy to have a conversation about your general circumstances. There's contact details on the slide. There's a QR code, and then there's an email address and a phone number. And please reach out to Helen, who's the sector lead in this area. And I think I've been talking too much, actually. That's where we've got to, Helen. Fantastic. We had more than 40 people on one stage. I see, Helen, we've got something in the chat. What's in the chat? Fiona says, Helen, hello. Yes.
Yeah, Fiona's asked whether this could lead to increased litigation. And it was when you were talking about notices.
I personally believe there are other factors which I haven't discussed today, which are going to lead to greater legislation. It's because a lot of the legal firms, not the only factor, but a lot of the legal firms have become very interested in procurement law for the first time. For many years, we only had a handful of litigators, of firms that specialized in procurement legislation and in challenge, in litigation. If you go on now to social media and you go into Google, you'll see that every legal firm suddenly has a procurement expert. And these lawyers are going to have to earn money at some stage. And the way they do it is through supporting litigation, actually, largely. I mean, they do other things as well. So I think that's one factor that's going to drive it. The other thing is there's far greater levels of transparency are going to create opportunities for challenge, which we've never seen before. The digitalization means that people are going to see when you've got it wrong. It's going to be easier to see where procurement law has not been followed. So yes, I think we might see increased litigation here for a whole host of reasons, Fiona. Absolutely. Right. Any other questions? We've got a minute left. I mean, what I urge you to do is if you have questions, if you'd like to know more, reach out to Helen, reach out through the contact details, and we'd love to have a conversation with you and go from there. I think that's it, Helen. I think we've reached the time. And I want to thank everybody for spending a half an hour with us, and I hope this was useful. I wish you a very good afternoon. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Walter.